In 1860, traveling across America could take months. A person leaving the East Coast might cross rivers, deserts, mountains, disease, storms, and thousands of miles of wilderness before reaching California. Some never arrived at all. America was growing, but it was still divided by distance. California had gold. The East had factories, banks, and much of the country's population. Between them stood nearly 2,000 miles of plains, deserts, mountains, and wilderness. Messages moved slowly, goods moved slowly, people moved slowly, and every mile between the Atlantic and Pacific felt like an obstacle. The journey could take months by wagon. Some traveled by ship around South America. Others crossed dangerous trails where accidents, disease, and starvation were constant threats. For a nation trying to grow, distance was becoming a problem. Many people dreamed of a solution. Merchants imagined it. Politicians debated it. Investors wanted it. Engineers wondered if it was even possible. Build a railroad across the entire continent. One continuous line of iron stretching from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. The idea sounded impossible. The route crossed deserts where water barely existed. It crossed mountains so steep that many believed no railroad could ever pass through them. It crossed territory that had never seen a locomotive. And yet the idea refused to die. One of the men who believed it could be done was Theodore Judah. Judah was an engineer. Unlike many others, he did not simply dream about a transcontinental railroad. He wanted to find a route. For years he studied maps and traveled through the American West. He became convinced that a railroad could cross the Sierra Nevada mountains if the correct path could be found. Most people thought he was wrong. The mountains were too steep. The winters were too brutal. The cost would be enormous. But Judah kept searching. Eventually, he identified a route through Donner Pass. It was difficult. It was dangerous. But it was possible. Now the project needed money. Judah traveled across California looking for investors. Most people refused. Then he found 4 businessmen willing to take the risk. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. Together, they became known as the Big Four. They would help create the company that would build westward from California. But a route and investors were not enough. The project still needed the support of the United States government. Then, history intervened. In 1861, the Civil War erupted. The nation was fighting for its survival. And strangely, that helped the railroad. For years, politicians had argued about where a transcontinental railroad should go. The war removed many of those arguments. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The United States had officially committed itself to one of the largest construction projects in human history. The plan was simple, on paper. Build a railroad from the east. Build another railroad from the west. Let them race toward each other, then connect them in the middle. Simple, on paper. Almost impossible in reality. Because before America could unite itself with iron, thousands of workers would have to cross some of the most dangerous landscapes on the continent. The race had 2 sides. From the east, the Union Pacific Railroad would build westward. From the west, the Central Pacific Railroad would build eastward. The goal was to meet somewhere in the middle of the continent. But this was not only an engineering project, it was a competition. The farther each company built, the more land, money, and power it could gain. Every mile mattered, every rail mattered, every day mattered. The Union Pacific began from the Missouri River, pushing west across the Great Plains. At first, the land looked easier than the mountains of California. There were wide open plains, long flat stretches, endless distance. But flat land did not mean easy work. The workers had to lay track across territory where supplies were hard to move. Water could be difficult to find, and danger could appear without warning. Rails had to be brought forward. Wooden ties had to be placed. Spikes had to be driven. Telegraph poles had to follow the track. Camps had to move again and again as the railroad pushed west. The work was not just laying iron. It was building a moving town across the continent. Blacksmiths, cooks, surveyors, teamsters, track layers, graders, carpenters, engineers, guards, laborers. Every group had a role. And every role had to keep moving. Behind the track came noise, smoke, tents, wagons, animals, saloons, arguments, and exhaustion. Ahead of the track waited more distance. The Union Pacific crews were often made up of Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, freedmen, and other laborers who needed work after years of conflict. Many had already seen danger. But the railroad gave them a different kind of hardship. Instead of battlefields, they faced heat, cold, storms, dust, accidents, and the endless pressure to keep laying track. The company wanted speed. The government rewarded miles. Investors wanted progress. And the men on the ground felt that pressure in their backs, hands, and legs. Each day, the crews moved forward. First came the surveyors, marking the route. Then graders cut and leveled the earth. Then workers placed wooden ties across the prepared ground. Rails were carried forward. Spikes were hammered down. Fish plates joined the rail ends. Ballast was packed beneath the track. Then the locomotive crept forward over the line that had just been built. And the whole process began again. A railroad did not cross America in one dramatic moment. It crossed America by repetition, tie after tie, rail after rail, spike after spike, mile after mile. But while the Union Pacific crossed the plains, the Central Pacific faced a different enemy. The Sierra Nevada Mountains. From California, the Central Pacific had to climb into rock, snow, cliffs, and granite. The route Theodore Judah had found made the railroad possible. But possible did not mean easy. The mountains did not welcome the railroad. They resisted it. Every foot had to be carved, blasted, or forced into place. The Central Pacific started with fewer workers. Many white laborers refused the hardest mountain work or left for better opportunities. The company needed men who would stay. Then Charles Crocker made a decision that changed the railroad forever. He began hiring Chinese workers. At first, some doubted them. They said the men were too small, too unfamiliar, too different. But the Chinese workers proved them wrong. They became some of the most disciplined and reliable workers on the entire project. They cleared land, moved rock, built roadbeds, laid track, carved tunnels, and carried the railroad into places where many believed no railroad could go. Their work was brutal. Their pay was lower than white workers. Their conditions were harsh. They often had to provide their own food. They faced racism, danger, and exhausting labor. But without them, the Central Pacific could not have crossed the Sierra Nevada the way it did. Soon, thousands of Chinese workers were building through the mountains. They worked with hand tools, black powder, carts, ropes, and muscle. They drilled holes into granite by hand. One man held a steel drill. Another swung a hammer. Strike after strike, the hole deepened. Then powder was packed inside. A fuse was lit. Men ran for cover. The blast shook the mountain. Rock fell. Dust filled the air. And when the smoke cleared, the workers returned. Again and again and again. This was how the railroad entered the mountains. Not with modern machines. Not with giant tunnel-boring equipment. But with hands, hammers, explosives, and men standing against stone. The deeper the railroad went into the Sierra Nevada, the more dangerous the work became. Cliffs blocked the path. Canyons opened beneath the route. Snow buried the camps. And granite slowed every mile. The companies called it progress. The workers felt it as pain. America was not just building a railroad. It was forcing a line of iron through the continent itself. The hardest part was not the plains, it was the mountains. The Sierra Nevada did not simply stand in the railroad's path, it became the enemy. For the Central Pacific workers, every mile meant stone, snow, danger, and exhaustion. The tracks could not simply be laid across the mountains. The mountains had to be cut open. Chinese workers climbed into places where one wrong step could send a man falling into the canyon below. Some worked on ledges barely wide enough for their boots. Others were lowered by ropes along cliff faces. Below them was empty air. In front of them was solid granite. In their hands were drills, hammers, and explosives. They had to drill holes into the rock, pack them with black powder, light the fuse, and escape before the blast tore the mountain apart. Sometimes the blast worked. Sometimes it did not. Sometimes rock fell the wrong way. Sometimes smoke filled the air so thick that men could barely see. Sometimes the mountain took a worker before anyone could stop it. The newspapers would later remember the railroad as progress. But progress did not feel beautiful to the men holding the drills. It felt like pain in the hands, dust in the lungs, cold in the bones, and fear that followed them from morning until night. The Central Pacific had to cut tunnels through the Sierra Nevada. Tunnel after tunnel, rock after rock, foot after foot. The most difficult was the Summit Tunnel near Donner Pass. It had to be carved through granite near the top of the mountains. The workers attacked it from both sides. They also dug vertical shafts from above, so more crews could work inside the mountain at the same time. Inside the tunnels, the air was dark and heavy. Candles and lamps gave weak light. Hammer strikes echoed against stone. Explosions shook the walls. Dust covered faces, clothes, and lungs. A man could work for hours and still see only a few inches of progress. The mountain did not care how tired they were. It did not care how badly America wanted the railroad. It only stood there, hard, cold, silent, and every day the workers returned to it. Then winter came. The Sierra Nevada winter was not ordinary cold. Snow fell in terrifying amounts. Storms buried camps. Tools disappeared beneath white drifts. Tracks vanished. Tents collapsed. Supply lines slowed. Men woke up surrounded by snow higher than their bodies. The railroad had to keep moving, but the mountains seemed determined to bury it alive. Workers shoveled snow again and again. They cleared paths. They protected supplies. They built snow sheds to cover the tracks. These snow sheds stretched for miles in some places, like wooden tunnels built to protect the railroad from the mountain above. But even the snow sheds were dangerous to build. Men worked in freezing wind. Hands went numb. Feet burned with cold. Clothes stayed wet. Food was limited, and every storm could undo days of work. Avalanches were one of the greatest fears. A sound could begin high above them, a crack, a roar. Then snow, ice, trees, and rock would come down the mountain with terrifying force. Men could disappear in seconds. Camps could be buried. Work sites could be destroyed. Sometimes there was no time to run. Sometimes there was nowhere to run. The railroad was not only being built across the Sierra Nevada, it was being built against the Sierra Nevada. And much of that burden fell on Chinese workers. They were asked to do some of the hardest and most dangerous jobs. They drilled, blasted, carried, shoveled, built, and returned again the next day. Many lived in rough camps near the work. Their days were long, Their pay was unequal, their treatment was unfair, and yet their discipline became the reason the Central Pacific kept moving. They cooked their own food, organized their own camps, worked in teams, and endured conditions that would have broken many others. When the snow came, they worked. When the tunnels slowed, they worked. When cliffs blocked the route, they worked. When the explosions failed, they returned to the rock and worked again. The mountain gave them nothing easily. Every mile had to be earned. Every foot of track carried a cost, and the cost was paid in bodies, breath, fear, and time. From far away, investors saw maps. Politicians saw progress. Newspapers saw a miracle of engineering. But inside the mountains, workers saw something else. They saw darkness inside tunnels. They saw friends injured by rock and blast. They saw snow bury the path they had cleared. They saw cliffs that could kill a man in one mistake. They saw a railroad that demanded everything from them and still asked for more. The Central Pacific kept pushing east, slowly, painfully, through granite, through winter, through tunnels, through cliffs, through exhaustion. And when the rails finally began to pass beyond the hardest mountains, it looked like victory. But for the workers who had carved the path, victory did not erase what the mountains had taken. America would remember the line of iron, but the Sierra Nevada remembered the men who cut through it. While the Central Pacific was fighting the mountains, the Union Pacific was racing across the plains. Its workers faced fewer tunnels and cliffs, but they faced a different challenge: speed. The railroad companies were paid by the mile. Every mile of completed track meant more money, more land, and more influence. The race became an obsession. Crews pushed forward across the Great Plains laying rail as quickly as possible. Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, freedmen, and laborers from many backgrounds worked side by side. The work was exhausting, tie after tie, rail after rail, spike after spike. The railroad advanced across the continent. Then, in 1869, one crew achieved something that seemed impossible. In a single day, workers laid roughly 10 miles of track. Thousands of ties, hundreds of rails, countless spikes. The record became one of the greatest achievements in railroad construction history. Now only one thing remained. The two railroads had to meet. At Promontory Summit, Utah, the two railroads finally met. The Central Pacific came from the west. The Union Pacific came from the east. After years of blasting, digging, freezing, sweating, and laying iron across America, the continent was finally connected by rail. On May 10, 1869, officials, railroad executives, photographers, and spectators gathered to witness the moment. A ceremonial golden spike was prepared. Telegraph wires were connected so the news could be sent across the nation. When the final spike was driven, celebrations erupted. For the first time in history, a person could travel across the United States by rail. What had once taken months could now be done in days. The railroad changed America. Cities grew. Trade expanded. Travel became faster. Information moved more quickly. The continent felt smaller. The impossible had become reality. But not everyone stood beside the golden spike. Many of the Chinese workers who had carved tunnels through the Sierra Nevada were absent from the ceremony. Many of the laborers who had laid the rails across the plains were missing as well. The photographs captured executives. The history books remembered companies. The nation celebrated the achievement. But thousands of workers returned to their camps, their jobs, or their next struggle. The railroad became a symbol of American progress. Yet, beneath every mile of track were the people who had carried it there. Men who drilled through mountains. Men who survived avalanches. Men who worked through heat, cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Men whose names were rarely recorded. Today, Trains still cross the routes they helped create. The mountains remain, the deserts remain, the rails remain. And so does their work. America remembers the Transcontinental Railroad as one of the greatest engineering achievements in its history. But it was built by ordinary workers who faced extraordinary hardships. The line of iron united a continent. The workers made it possible. History has hidden many more workers whose names were never known. But the roads, bridges, tunnels, dams, and railroads they built are still standing. Every one of them deserves to be remembered. Subscribe so you don't miss the hidden stories history left behind.